In a world increasingly divided by ideological narratives, Vladimir Putin often emerges as the West's most prominent adversary. His image has been crafted into that of a lone villain, intent on disrupting global democracy and stability. But what if the story of Vladimir Putin and modern Russia is not just about his ambitions or ideology? What if it is, in part, a consequence of the West's own decisions? The decline of American unipolarity, NATO's unrestrained expansion, and the resurgence of BRICS nations all point to a broader geopolitical shift. To understand Putin, we must first examine the post-Soviet chaos that shaped modern Russia, the role of Western policy failures, and the alternative world order led by BRICS, a rising coalition of diverse and powerful nations challenging the waning influence of the West. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it marked the end of a bipolar world order. For Russia, this was not merely a political shift, but a socio-economic catastrophe. The Russian Federation inherited a crumbling infrastructure, a struggling economy, and a population demoralized by decades of Cold War tension. Yet, there was hope. Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, sought integration into the Western-led global order. Yeltsin's olive branch was clear. In his 1992 address to the US Congress, he declared, "The people of Russia are offering their hand in friendship to build a better world. A world without war, a world of peace." This was not empty rhetoric. Many Russians yearned for partnership with the West, envisioning a future akin to post-World War II Germany or Japan, two former adversaries rebuilt into thriving democracies under the Marshall Plan. However, the United States chose a different path. Rather than embracing Russia as a partner, the US and its allies treated the country as a defeated adversary. Instead of economic aid and integration, they imposed shock therapy economic reforms that prioritized Western financial interests at the expense of Russian stability. This led to a decade of unprecedented hardship for ordinary Russians. The 1990s were a dark period for Russia. Western advisors pushed privatization schemes that dismantled state-owned industries, creating an oligarch class that monopolized wealth and power. Public spending on health, education, and welfare was slashed under International Monetary Fund directives, leaving millions in poverty. By 1998, Russia's GDP had collapsed by more than 50%, and male life expectancy had plummeted by 5 years. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz likened this economic devastation to the destruction Russia faced during World War II. This chaos was fertile ground for a leader like Vladimir Putin. When he assumed the presidency in 1999, Putin capitalized on the public's disillusionment with the West. He promised stability, strength, and a return to national pride. His early economic reforms and crackdown on oligarchic corruption resonated deeply with a population scarred by a decade of suffering. The narrative that NATO's expansion was a defensive measure against Russian aggression falls apart under scrutiny. During the 1990s, Russia was at its weakest. The country was economically devastated and militarily irrelevant. Yet instead of fostering partnership, NATO chose to expand eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics. This expansion violated verbal assurances given to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990. Western leaders had promised that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if Germany were reunified. However, these promises were quickly abandoned. By 2004, NATO had expanded to include the Baltic states, placing military infrastructure directly on Russia's borders. For Putin, NATO's expansion was not merely a geopolitical challenge, it was an existential threat. His early attempts to integrate Russia into Western institutions, such as NATO and the European Union, were met with rejection. In 2000, Putin proposed Russia's membership in NATO. The proposal was dismissed, reinforcing the perception that the West sought to isolate and undermine Russia, rather than embrace it as a partner. Western leaders often champion a rules-based international order, rooted in democracy, human rights, and free markets. Yet their actions frequently betray these principles. The United States, for example, has supported authoritarian regimes, engaged in unilateral military interventions, and violated international norms when convenient. One glaring example is the U.S. quote, "S simultaneous condemnation of Russian actions in Ukraine and its unconditional support for Israel's actions in Gaza." In Ukraine, the US frames Russia as a violator of sovereignty and a perpetrator of war crimes. Meanwhile, it funds and arms Israel as it conducts operations that result in widespread civilian casualties. This double standard erodes the credibility of Western narratives, particularly in the global South. The hypocrisy extends to the economic sphere. The US has imposed crippling sanctions on Russia, claiming to uphold international law. Yet these sanctions disproportionately harm ordinary Russians, while allowing Western corporations to profit from loopholes. The global South sees these actions not as the defense of democracy, but as the West's attempt to maintain hegemony at any cost. While the West grapples with its waning influence, a new power bloc has emerged. BRICS, originally comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has expanded in 2024 to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Argentina, and Iran. This coalition represents over 40% of the world's population and a significant portion of global GDP. The BRICS nations are not merely economic partners, they represent an ideological challenge to Western dominance. They advocate for a multipolar world order, where no single nation or bloc dictates global policy. This resonates deeply with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that have long been marginalized by Western-led institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Key initiatives like the BRICS New Development Bank offer alternatives to Western financial systems. These institutions prioritize sustainable development without the political strings attached to Western aid. For nations in the global South, BRICS represents not just an economic opportunity, but a pathway to true sovereignty. Western analysts often struggle to understand Putin's enduring popularity among Russians. This support is rooted in the contrast between the chaos of the 1990s and the relative stability of Putin's tenure. Under his leadership, Russia's GDP grew steadily from 1999 to 2012. Infrastructure improved, and poverty rates declined. For many Russians, Putin is not a dictator, but a stabilizing force who restored national pride. The West's portrayal of Putin as a tyrant ignores the broader context. Russians remember the humiliation of the 1990s and see Putin as the leader who stood up to the West. His actions in Crimea and Ukraine, while controversial, are viewed by many as a defense of Russian sovereignty against an encroaching NATO. The unipolar world order led by the United States is rapidly unraveling. Economic inequality, political polarization, and declining trust in institutions have weakened Western democracies. In contrast, BRICS nations are experiencing economic growth, technological innovation, and increasing global influence. The West's reliance on sanctions, military interventions, and propaganda has alienated much of the global South. Countries are turning to BRICS for trade, investment, and diplomatic partnerships. This shift marks the beginning of a multipolar world, where the West is no longer the sole arbiter of global affairs. The rise of Vladimir Putin and the resurgence of Russia cannot be understood without examining the failures of Western foreign policy. By isolating Russia, expanding NATO, and imposing destructive economic reforms, the West created the conditions for Putin's rise. At the same time, the hypocrisy of the rules-based order has undermined the credibility of Western narratives, particularly in the global South. The emergence of BRICS as a powerful coalition signals the end of Western hegemony. This new world order is not without challenges, but it offers a vision of cooperation and equality that stands in stark contrast to the West's legacy of exploitation and hypocrisy. If the West wishes to remain relevant in this changing landscape, it must confront its past mistakes and embrace a future of genuine partnership rather than domination. Only then can the cycle of conflict and alienation be broken. What if I told you there is more to the story about Vladimir Putin? What if I told you that Vladimir Putin's actions today are the direct result of some of the worst foreign policy mistakes made by the US government? I know these are bold statements to make, and before you write me off and dismiss this video, I want you to understand the angle I'm coming from. For the past decade, Russia and Ukraine have been engaged in a devastating conflict that has destabilized Europe and brought tremendous instability to the world. But Putin didn't just appear out of thin air. He has been at the top of the Russian government for nearly a quarter of a century. But the majority of people have yet to hear the full story of how the US government treated Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how US foreign policy created the perfect conditions for a political leader like Vladimir Putin to rise up into power. The West loves to portray Russia, and specifically Putin, as one of America's greatest enemies. But here's the twist. Did you know that Russia was actually desperate to be integrated into the West? Just listen to this clip from Vladimir Putin, a French-born Russian-American journalist. After the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Yeltsin came to the United States and he addressed a joint session of Congress, and he said, "The people of Russia are offering their hand to the people of the United States in friendship to build a better world, a world without war, a world without peace." And this was exactly what the vast majority of Russians wanted. And I would even say that today, the vast majority of Russians would like to have, if not a friendship with the United States, at least a partnership. You see, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States government faced a difficult decision. How is it going to treat this new entity called Russia? The United States had two very clear options. The first was to treat Russia the same way it treated former enemies Germany and Italy after World War II. After the war, Europe was in complete shambles and desperately needed direct foreign investment to rebuild the continent. The US government saw an opportunity to bring Europe into its sphere of influence and pledge billions of dollars to rebuild all of Europe. This plan was called the Marshall Plan and paved the way to the better governments, better infrastructure, and the Europe we all know today. The second option was to continue treating Russia as the enemy, never forgive them for their actions during the Cold War, and treat them as an inferior state that should never be integrated into Western society. Once again, Vladimir Putin reveals which option the US government chose. And basically that view was the one that was accepted. It was the one that was accepted, and the attitude towards Russia was pretty much, they're no longer a superpower, you are a second-rate country, just keep quiet, please. Now fast forward to early 2000, when Vladimir Putin emerged as Russia's new leader. Putin's very first move as president was to ask for Russia's entry into NATO, which actually makes perfect sense. NATO was created to combat the rise of the Soviet Union, but at this point, the Soviet Union had already been disbanded for over 9 years. So why couldn't Russia join NATO now and contribute to combating any future threats? Putin's proposal was immediately dismissed with the implication that Russia was irrelevant. Not deterred, Putin tried a different route. If the US wasn't going to let Russia join NATO, then what about integrating into the West through membership into the European Union? Once again, Putin was rejected. This time he was told that Russia was too big and would hold too much influence in the bloc. Two missed opportunities and two major events that heavily influenced the direction Vladimir Putin and Russia would develop in the coming years. Just imagine how different our world would look like today if Russia was a leading EU member alongside Germany, integrated into NATO, and fostering an alliance with the United States so strong that NATO itself would no longer have any reason to exist. That world was possible. But instead, the United States chose to alienate, isolate, and provoke Russia, ultimately leading us to the situation we face today. One of the terms we often hear from US politicians is the international rules-based order. It is a narrative that frames the West as the upholders of international law, democracy, and the principles set forth by organizations like the United Nations. For a clear example of what I mean, just look at this tweet sent from Secretary of State Antony Blinken. "We stand with all human rights defenders who fight against repression and advocate for fundamental freedoms. The US and our partners will continue to work toward a world in which all nations uphold and strive towards the principle that human rights belong to everyone, everywhere." It's an excellent message, except for one problem. The US government is one of the largest violators of human rights in the world, and with the rise of social media, the cracks in this narrative are becoming impossible to ignore. While the United States is quick to slam Vladimir Putin as a war criminal and condemn his actions in Ukraine, US politicians simultaneously support Benjamin Netanyahu and send billions of dollars worth of weapons to carry out death and destruction across the Middle East. The hypocrisy of the United States stands between the wars in Ukraine and Gaza is shocking. Just watch this clip to see firsthand how the US government justifies war actions in Gaza, but then turns around and condemns the same actions in Ukraine. Being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties, and that there likely will be more, is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy. I've said that before. The president also said that yesterday. Doesn't mean we have to like it. It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that. Spare us the fake tears. The message sent to the world is clear. To the US government, Ukrainian lives are worth more than their Palestinian counterparts. The world sees this double standard, and it's why the majority of the developing world has lost faith in this rules-based order. But at a time when democracies in the United States and Europe are both facing crises of legitimacy and power, Putin has become the perfect scapegoat. David Waring's 2019 article entitled "How the West Helped to Make Putin" says it perfectly. The antagonist of the hour is Vladimir Putin, a character who represents everything the West is not. Authoritarian rather than democratic, thuggish rather than humanitarian, and a threat to rather than an upholder of the liberal international order led since World War II by the US. Moreover, at a time when Western power, perhaps even the West itself, is undergoing a period of crisis, Putin is the culprit, the mischief maker subverting our democracies and dragging us beneath our usual impeccable standards. What's incredible here is that this article was written in 2019, but fast forward to today, and these statements still remain true. By crafting this simplistic narrative of the West versus Putin's Russia, our politicians frame one side as inherently good and the other as inherently bad. This ignores the role the West played in creating these conditions. Don't forget what I said earlier. The US had two options on how to treat Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They chose option number 2, and with it came undeniable chaos for the common citizens of Russia. Let's break it down. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the United States sent in advisors and diplomats to help shape Russia's transition to a market economy. They imposed what they called an economic liberalization program. The United States wanted to shift Russia from communism to free market capitalism. They did exactly that, but prioritized Western financial interests at the expense of Russian stability. State-owned industries were privatized at bargain prices and sold to a small group of wealthy, well-connected Russians. This process created the oligarch class, who ruled Russia in the 1990s under a corrupt system of crony capitalism. And this is where the United States missed the mark completely. If the US helped Russia integrate into Western society, Russia would look very different today. But the West took advantage of a weak Russia, and here is what happened to the majority of Russian citizens. At the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund, public spending on health, education, pensions and welfare were slashed by 50%. Food prices tripled almost overnight, and in just 7 years, the number of Russians living on less than $4 a day skyrocketed from 2 million to 60 million. Male life expectancy dropped by 5 years, and violent crime surged. All of this resulted in Russia's economy collapsing by more than 50% from 1990 to 1998. The West's actions didn't just fail, they devastated Russia. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz later compared the economic destruction of the 1990s to the devastation Russia experienced during World War II. This was a far cry from what Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, had envisioned for the country. Gorbachev had hoped for a transition to a Nordic-style social democracy, a mixed economy with strong public services, high taxes, and a government accountable to parliament rather than an authoritarian strongman. Instead of looking like something like Sweden or Finland, the West created a country ravaged by violence and corruption, with very little economic prospects for the future. And this is exactly how Vladimir Putin came to power. When Putin began his rule as president, the first thing he did was crack down on the oligarchs. He didn't dismantle the system the West had built, he rebalanced it. Power shifted from the billionaire class to the state, with Putin firmly in control. Cronyism didn't disappear, it was just placed under his authority. After the chaos of the 1990s, Russian citizens saw this as a relief. Once again, let's look at this chart showing Russia's GDP growth, and we can see how Russia's economy entered a new phase of economic growth under Putin during this stage 2 period of growth from 1999 to 2012. When people in the West express confusion about Putin's popularity, or why so many Russians reject the liberal international order, the answer is simple. Russians remember the chaos of the 1990s. They know the West played a large role in the economic crisis, but also remember who was the leader who pulled them out of it. Now let's talk about NATO. Western leaders want you to believe that NATO's expansion was a defensive response to an aggressive Russia, a country supposedly desperate to recreate the former Soviet Union by expanding westward into Europe. But this narrative falls apart under scrutiny. The reality is that Russia did nothing to provoke NATO or the West. NATO's expansion began when Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, was at its weakest, economically devastated, and practically a vessel to Washington. At that point, Russia was hardly a threat to anyone. The aim of NATO's expansion wasn't defense. It was to ensure that Russia would never regain its power or influence. And once again, Vladimir Putin reveals the truth. Take the time from when Gorbachev came to power, March 1985 to 2007, when Putin has been in power for 7 years. That's 22 years. I ask you to find a single thing in foreign or domestic policies done by the Soviet Union while it still existed, and then Russia proper, that might in any way anger, irk, disappoint the United States. Let me answer that for you. Nothing. Not one thing during that period. Now, what did Russia get as a result of that? First, the enlargement of NATO. Russia made every effort to appease the West, hoping to build a partnership. And what did they get in return? An existential military threat placed right on their doorstep. If you want an extensive analysis on how aggressively expanding NATO led to this war in Ukraine, I did a full breakdown on this in another video, which I'll link at the end of today's presentation. But the West's narrative about Putin as a lone villain and threat to democracy conveniently omits its own role in creating the very circumstances that led to his rise. And let's be clear, this isn't about excusing Putin's actions, it's about understanding them in the broader context. The chaos of the 1990s didn't just happen, it was the direct result of Western intervention. And when the Russian people saw no other option, they turned to someone who promised stability, strength, and a way out of the mess the West had left behind. The policies that devastated Russia's economy, created the oligarch class, and expanded NATO's reach to Russia's borders were not accidental. They were deliberate. They were designed to sideline Russia, to prevent it from ever being a global power again. And yet, these very actions paved the way for Putin's rise and his enduring popularity at home. The lessons from this are clear. If the West wants to understand the dynamics at play in Russia and Ukraine today, it needs to start by looking at its own history. Ignoring this history won't erase it, and pretending Putin's rise was inevitable only ensures that the same mistakes will be repeated elsewhere. The narrative of the West versus Putin may make for good headlines, but it does nothing to address the deeper causes of this conflict. The question we should be asking is not just how Putin came to power, but how the choices made by the United States and Europe helped create him. Until those questions are answered, the cycle of alienation, provocation, and conflict will continue, and the further decline of the West will continue as the BRICS bloc is rising more and more.